Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly, or perhaps it was something else, a recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty. And even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who'd been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that 2 of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and their interpretation was a specialised skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The chief cupbearer went first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. "This is what it means," he said gently. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace, but first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row, he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them, they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time, Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, He was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offense. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials. But now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph. the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. You intended to harm me, he would later tell them, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing. This is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of Sacred Slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specializes in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow. Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day treated you? Perhaps you're settling into evening wherever you are in the world, or maybe you're finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day to pause and breathe. Whether you're listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside, from the mountains or by the sea, you are welcome here. What time is it where you are right now? Are you watching the sun set through your window, or perhaps the stars are already painting the sky above you? No matter where you find yourself in this beautiful world we share, you've found your way to this sacred space, and I'm so grateful you're here. If this story brings you peace tonight, I'd be honoured if you'd consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. Your presence in our community means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing these timeless stories that remind us of hope, faith, and the gentle strength that carries us through life's seasons. Now let's settle in together for tonight's story. Take a deep breath with me. Let your shoulders drop. Let your heart rest. Tonight, we journey to an ancient land, to a time of great drought and scarcity, where we'll meet a widow whose small act of faith would echo through the ages. This is the story of bread in the drought, the story of the widow of Zarephath. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Israel, its rays sharp as bronze swords piercing through air that shimmered with heat. Not a cloud had crossed the sky for months, and the land lay barren and broken, crying out for relief that would not come. This was the drought that Elijah had prophesied, the drought that would bring a proud king to his knees and teach a nation that there was still a God in Israel. Elijah moved like a shadow across the wilderness, his weathered feet finding paths where others saw only desolation. His dark hair hung long and wild, his beard streaked with dust from countless days of wandering. The rough camel's hair that wrapped around his lean frame had become his second skin, and the leather belt at his waist held the simple tools of a man who had learned to survive on little. But Elijah was no ordinary wanderer. He was a prophet of the Most High God, and his words had the power to shut up the heavens themselves. When he had stood before King Ahab in his glittering palace, surrounded by the false prophets of Baal and Asherah, Elijah had spoken with the authority of heaven itself. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Those words had sealed his fate as a fugitive. Ahab's rage had been swift and terrible, and Queen Jezebel's thirst for the prophet's blood was legendary throughout the land. So Elijah had fled, following the voice of God that whispered to him in the wind, that spoke to him in the silence of the wilderness, that guided his steps away from the palaces of men and toward the humble places where faith still flickered like a candle in the darkness. For months God had provided for his prophet in the most unlikely ways. By the brook Cherith, ravens had brought him bread and meat morning and evening, their black wings carrying sustenance from heaven itself. Elijah had learned to read the language of divine provision, to trust in a God who could command the birds of the air and the streams of the earth to serve his purposes. But as the drought deepened and the brook dried up, God's voice came to Elijah again, gentle but unmistakable. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Zarephath. The name itself meant refining or smelting place, a fitting destination for a prophet who was learning daily what it meant to be refined by fire, to have the dross of self-reliance burned away until only faith remained. It was a small coastal town in Phoenicia, in what we now call Lebanon, far from the borders of Israel and the reach of Ahab's soldiers. As Elijah walked the dusty roads towards Zarephath, his mind turned over the peculiar nature of God's provision. Not to a wealthy merchant's house would he go, not to a palace or a place of abundance. God was sending him to a widow, a woman who in that ancient world would have been among the most vulnerable, the most likely to be in need herself. And she was a Gentile, a foreigner, one who did not worship the God of Israel. Yet this was how the Almighty worked, Elijah had learned. He chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak things to shame the strong. He provided for his servants not through the expected channels of power and wealth, but through the humble offerings of those who had little to give but gave it anyway. The journey to Zarephath took Elijah through landscapes that told the story of the drought's devastation. Wells that had once bubbled with clear water stood empty, their stones exposed and cracking in the heat. Fields that should have been green with growing grain stretched out like brown parchment. The soil so hard it rang under his footsteps like pottery. Trees that had weathered centuries of seasons now stood leafless and dying. their branches reaching toward a pitiless sky like the arms of supplicants begging for mercy. In the villages he passed through, Elijah saw the human cost of the judgment he had pronounced. Children with hollow eyes clung to their mothers' skirts, their small faces etched with the premature wisdom that comes from knowing hunger. Men sat in the shade of buildings, their hands idle because there was no work to be done in fields that would not grow. Women walked great distances with empty water jars, returning with barely enough to wet their families' lips. Yet Elijah did not waver in his conviction that he had spoken truly the word of the Lord. This drought would serve its purpose in drawing the hearts of the people back to the God they had abandoned for the seductive promises of Baal, the god of storms and fertility who had proven powerless to bring rain when it was most needed. Sometimes the mercy of God looked like judgment, and the healing had to begin with the pain of truth. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah could smell the salt of the Mediterranean Sea, could hear the distant cry of gulls wheeling over waters that mocked the thirsty land with their abundance. The town spread before him, small and unpretentious, its whitewashed buildings clustered around a modest marketplace. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, and even here, far from Israel, the drought had left its mark in the form of empty gardens and worried faces. Elijah paused at the crest of the hill, looking down at the place where God had promised him provision. Somewhere in that humble town was a widow who would supply him with food, though she herself was surely struggling to survive. The prophet's heart stirred with curiosity and a deep sense of anticipation. What manner of woman would God choose for such a task? What kind of faith would he find in this foreign place? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as Elijah made his way down the hill and through the narrow streets of Zarephath. The town was quiet in the afternoon heat, most of its people taking shelter in the cool shadows of their homes. A few merchants sat listlessly beside their stalls, their wares meagre and their customers few. Children played half-heartedly in the dust, their games subdued by the oppressive weight of want that hung over everything like a heavy blanket. Elijah walked with purpose toward the town gate, the place where travellers traditionally stopped to rest and where the business of daily life was conducted. It was there, God had whispered to his spirit, that he would find the woman who would provide for him. As he approached the gate, his eyes searched the few people moving about in the late afternoon shadows, looking for a sign, a divine indication of which among them was the widow God had prepared. And then he saw her. She was gathering sticks near the city gate, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone conserving every ounce of strength for an essential task. Elijah knew immediately that this was the woman God had sent him to find, not through any dramatic sign or heavenly voice, but through the quiet certainty that settled in his spirit like dew on morning grass. The widow of Zarephath was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that indefinite middle season of life where hope and despair wage their daily battle in a woman's heart. Her dark hair was partially covered by a simple headscarf, and her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of years of making do with little. Her hands, as she bent to gather the dry branches scattered near the gate, were the hands of one who had worked hard for everything she had ever possessed. There was something in her posture, in the careful way she selected each stick and added it to her small bundle, that spoke of finality. These were not the movements of someone gathering fuel for many meals to come, but of someone preparing for a last act, a final ceremony before surrendering to whatever fate awaited. Elijah approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. In her concentration on her task, she had not yet noticed the travel-worn prophet making his way toward her. When she finally looked up, her eyes registered first surprise, then the wary caution of a woman who had learned to be careful around strangers. "Peace be with you," Elijah said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of one who understood what it meant to be far from home and dependent on the kindness of others. The widow straightened, still holding her bundle of sticks against her chest like a shield. "And with you, traveller," she replied, her voice soft but tinged with the wariness of one who had little left to lose and could therefore afford few mistakes. Elijah gestured toward the well that stood near the gate, its depths long since dry, but its stone rim still serving as a place for travellers to rest. "Could you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" The request was simple enough, the kind of hospitality that travellers routinely requested and that kind hearts routinely provided. But as the widow looked toward the well, Elijah saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of pain that told him water too had become precious in this place. Still she nodded. "I will see what I can do," she said, and began to turn away to fulfill his request. But Elijah's voice stopped her. "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned. The widow turned back to face him, and now Elijah could see the full weight of her circumstances written in the lines around her eyes, in the slight tremor of her hands as she clutched her bundle of sticks more tightly. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words struck Elijah's heart like physical blows. Here was not abundance hiding behind false modesty, not plenty disguised as poverty. Here was the raw truth of scarcity, spoken with the quiet dignity of one who had already made peace with her fate. This woman was preparing her last meal, gathering these few sticks to kindle a final fire that would cook the final handful of flour into one last piece of bread for herself and her child. In her simple statement, Elijah heard echoes of every widow's story, every mother's nightmare. She had watched her resources dwindle day by day, week by week, had portioned out ever smaller meals until there was nothing left to portion. Now she had reached the end of her rope, the bottom of her jar, the last of her oil. She'd perhaps spent sleepless nights calculating and recalculating, hoping against hope that somehow her meagre supplies would stretch just one more day, one more meal. And here was a stranger, a foreign prophet, asking her to share even this last morsel. Elijah looked into her eyes and saw not just physical hunger, but the deeper starvation of hope deferred, of prayers that seemed to fall on deaf ears, of a God who had seemed absent in her hour of greatest need. Yet he also saw something else, something that made his heart leap with recognition. He saw faith. Not the bold, declarative faith of those who had much to lose, but the quiet, desperate faith of those who had nothing left but trust. The prophet's next words would either build a bridge of hope or collapse the last foundation of this woman's world. He chose them carefully, knowing that he was not speaking merely his own thoughts, but carrying a message from the heart of God himself. "Don't be afraid," Elijah said, his voice gentle but filled with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." The widow's eyes widened. Was this stranger mad? Was he so callous, so utterly without compassion, that he would ask a dying woman to feed him before she fed her own child? The request seemed to defy every principle of human decency, every natural law of survival and maternal love. But Elijah was not finished speaking. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The promise hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial, the kind of words that could either transform a life or break a heart with false hope. The widow stared at this strange prophet with his wild hair and sun-darkened skin, this man who claimed to speak for the God of Israel, a foreign deity she had heard of but never worshipped. How could she possibly believe such a thing? How could a handful of flour become an endless supply? How could a few drops of oil multiply like the stars of heaven? Every practical bone in her body, every lesson learned through years of careful management and hard-won survival, told her this was impossible. Yet something in Elijah's eyes, something in the quiet confidence with which he spoke these impossible words, awakened an echo in her heart. Perhaps it was the memory of childhood stories her grandmother had told, tales of gods and miracles from the ancient days. Perhaps it was the sheer desperation of a mother who would try anything, believe anything, if it meant one more day of life for her son. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that recognised in this weathered prophet's promise the voice of the same divine love that had sustained her through every previous trial, that had somehow always provided just enough, just when she needed it most, until now. The widow looked down at her bundle of sticks, then back at Elijah. She thought of her son waiting at home, trusting her to return with enough fuel to cook their final meal. She thought of the empty jar that had once held pounds of flour, now scraped clean except for that last precious handful. She thought of the oil jug that had once gurgled with golden liquid, now holding barely enough to moisten the flour into dough. And then she thought of something else, the strange peace that had settled over her heart as Elijah spoke his impossible promise. It was not the peace of understanding, for she understood nothing of what he proposed. It was not the peace of certainty, for everything in her circumstances screamed that his words were foolishness. It was the peace of surrender, the peace that comes when one has exhausted all human possibilities and stands at the edge of mystery, ready to step into the unknown. "I will do as you have said," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through all eternity. The walk back to her small home felt both eternal and instantaneous to the widow. Each step carried her further from the safety of reasonable despair and closer to the dangerous territory of hope. The bundle of sticks in her arms seemed to grow heavier with each pace, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented, the fuel for a miracle she dared not quite believe in, yet could not quite dismiss. Her house stood at the end of a narrow alley, its walls built of the same white stone as most of the buildings in Zarephath, its roof flat and practical. It was small but carefully maintained, the kind of home that spoke of pride surviving in the face of poverty. A few clay pots stood near the doorway, empty now except for the dust that had settled in them during the long months of drought. As she approached her door, the widow could hear movement inside, the soft sounds of her son moving about in the dim interior. He was perhaps 10 years old, still young enough to trust completely in his mother's ability to provide, yet old enough to understand the gravity of their situation. He had not complained when the meals grew smaller and less frequent, had not questioned why she sometimes gave him her portion, while claiming she wasn't hungry. Now she would have to explain to him that she was going to give away their last food to a stranger. The door opened with a soft creak of wood that had swollen and shrunk through many seasons. Inside, the house was cool and shadowy, a welcome relief from the blazing heat of the afternoon sun. Her son looked up from where he sat near the window, his young face brightening at her return. "Did you find enough wood, Mother?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a child who'd learned not to expect too much, but could not quite stop hoping. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and looked around the familiar space of her home. Everything was clean and in its place, though there was precious little to arrange. A few cooking vessels, some worn but serviceable garments, a small table, sleeping mats that she rolled up each morning and spread each evening. The jar of flour sat in the corner where she always kept it, and beside it the small jug of oil. The son followed her gaze to the corner where their last provisions waited. He had watched those containers grow emptier day by day, had seen his mother peer into them each morning with expressions that grew more worried as the contents diminished. He knew, with the intuitive wisdom that children possess, that today would be their last day of having anything to eat. "Mother," he said again, sensing something different in her manner, something that hadn't been there when she left to gather the wood. The widow moved to the corner and lifted the flour jar, feeling the pitiful weight of what remained inside. Then she picked up the oil jug, tilting it slightly to gauge how little was left. The sound of the oil moving in the nearly empty vessel was like a whisper, like the last breath of hope dying away. But then she remembered Elijah's words, remembered the strange certainty in his voice when he spoke of jars that would not empty, and jugs that would not run dry. She remembered the peace that had settled over her heart when she agreed to his impossible request. "My son," she said gently, kneeling beside him so they were at eye level. "Something wonderful and strange has happened today. A prophet of the God of Israel has come to our town, and he has asked me to share our food with him." The boy's eyes widened. "Our food? But mother, we only have enough for—" "For one meal, yes," she finished for him. "I know, but this prophet, his name is Elijah, has promised me something that seems impossible. He says that if I feed him first, then our jar of flour will not be used up, and our jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The child stared at his mother, processing this information with the serious concentration of one who had learned that adult decisions often determined whether children lived or died. "Do you believe him, mother?" It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything. Did she believe? Could she stake their lives on the promise of a foreign prophet? Could she risk her son's survival on words that defied every law of nature she had ever observed? The widow was quiet for a long moment, looking into her son's trusting eyes. Then she smiled, and it was the first real smile that had crossed her face in months. "I don't know if I believe him with my mind, my son, but my heart tells me that we have nothing left to lose, and perhaps everything to gain. Sometimes faith means stepping forward when you cannot see the path." She stood and moved toward the corner where their supplies waited. "Help me build a fire, and we will make bread for the prophet first, as he asked. And then we will see what the God of Israel will do for a widow and her son in Zarephath." The boy nodded solemnly and began arranging the sticks his mother had gathered while she prepared to perform what might be either an act of supreme faith or supreme foolishness. The distinction, she realized, might not matter as much as she had thought. Working together, they built a small fire outside their door, the flames dancing bright against the darkening sky. The widow poured water into her mixing bowl, then opened the flour jar and looked inside. The handful that remained seemed pitifully small, barely enough for one small loaf, certainly not enough for 2 meals as Elijah had promised. But she had given her word, and more than that, she had felt something stir in her heart when the prophet spoke. Perhaps it was only desperation disguised as faith, but it was all she had to offer. Carefully, reverently, she poured half of the remaining flour into her bowl. Then she tilted the oil jug and let a few precious drops fall into the mixture. The oil gleamed golden in the firelight, and she found herself thinking of ancient stories, half-remembered tales of gods who provided for their people in miraculous ways. As she mixed the flour and oil with water, kneading the small portion of dough with practiced hands, the widow felt a strange sense of ceremony settling over the simple task. This was no ordinary bread-making. This was an act of faith performed in the face of impossible circumstances, a leap into the unknown guided only by the promise of a prophet and the whisper of hope in her own heart. The dough came together under her hands, soft and elastic despite the small amount of oil. She shaped it into a small round loaf and placed it on the flat stone they used for baking, setting it carefully over the coals. The bread began to bake, filling the evening air with the ancient comforting aroma of grain transformed by fire. As they waited for the bread to cook, the widow and her son sat quietly by the fire. The boy leaned against his mother's side, and she wrapped her arm around him, holding him close. Whatever happened next, whatever the morning would bring, they had this moment of peace together. When the bread was finished, golden and warm from the stones, the widow wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth and stood. "I will take this to the prophet now," she told her son. "While I am gone, keep the fire burning. When I return, we'll make our own bread and see if the promise holds true." The walk back to the city gate seemed shorter this time, though the weight of what she carried felt immeasurable. This small loaf represented everything she had left in the world, the last of her resources, the final hedge against starvation. She was literally carrying her life in her hands, offering it to a stranger based on nothing more than his word. Elijah was waiting where she had left him, sitting quietly in the gathering dusk. When he saw her approaching with the wrapped bread, his face lit up with a smile that transformed his austere features. It was not the smile of one who had expected to be obeyed, but of one who was genuinely moved by the sacrifice he was witnessing. "Thank you," he said simply as she placed the bread in his hands. What you have done requires more courage than facing down armies or calling fire from heaven. You have chosen to trust when you had every reason to doubt." The widow watched as he unwrapped the bread, still warm and fragrant from the fire. "I pray your God honours your promise, prophet. My son and I have nothing left but this hope you have given us." Elijah broke the bread and ate it slowly, savouring each bite not just for its nourishment but for what it represented. "He will honour it," the prophet said with quiet certainty. "Go home now and prepare your own meal. The jar of flour will not be empty." As the widow walked home through the darkening streets of Zarephath, she felt as though she were walking through a dream. Had she really just given away their last food to a stranger? Had she really staked everything on the promise of a foreign god? The practical part of her mind screamed that she had made the most foolish decision of her life. But another part of her, a deeper part that had been silent for so long she had almost forgotten it existed, whispered that she had just participated in something holy, something that would echo through eternity. She'd chosen faith over fear, trust over self-preservation, hope over despair. Now she would discover whether faith was strong enough to fill an empty jar. The widow's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the flour jar upon returning home. Her son sat by the fire, his young face illuminated by the dancing flames, watching his mother with the intense attention of one whose very life hung in the balance of what would happen next. The jar felt the same in her hands as it had an hour before, neither heavier nor lighter. There was no external sign that anything miraculous had occurred, no glow of divine presence, no heavenly music announcing supernatural intervention, just a simple clay vessel that might contain their salvation or their final disappointment. The widow closed her eyes for a moment, offering a wordless prayer to whatever divine power might be listening. Then she lifted the jar and looked inside. The flour was there, not overflowing, not abundant, but there. The same handful that had been there before, perhaps even a little more. Enough for another small loaf of bread, enough for one more meal. The widow blinked, wondering if her desperate hope was playing tricks on her vision. She reached into the jar with trembling fingers, feeling the soft texture of the flour, confirming that it was real and not some mirage born of starvation and desperation. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder in her expression. "Is it true? Is the flour still there?" "It's still here," she replied, her voice filled with amazement. "There's enough for our bread." With reverent hands she measured out flour for their evening meal, leaving what appeared to be the same small amount in the bottom of the jar. Then she reached for the oil jug, tilting it carefully to pour just enough to bind the flour into dough. The oil flowed golden and pure, and when she set the jug aside it still contained what seemed to be the same small amount it had held before. As she mixed their bread, the widow felt as though she were participating in something beyond the natural order of things. Each movement of her hands felt sacred, each ingredient holy. This was not just food preparation, this was communion with the divine, a daily miracle made manifest through the simple elements of flour and oil and fire. The bread they ate that night tasted different somehow, though it was made from the same ingredients as countless other loaves she had baked over the years. It tasted of hope, of promise, of a future that extended beyond the next meal. As they shared the warm bread in the light of their small fire, the widow and her son spoke in hushed tones, as if they were in the presence of something too wonderful to fully comprehend. That night, as the widow spread their sleeping mats and prepared for rest, she found herself looking repeatedly toward the corner where the flour jar and oil jug sat. Would they still contain their precious contents in the morning? Or would she wake to find them empty, the miracle revealed as nothing more than a cruel dream? But when dawn broke over Zarephath, painting the walls of her small home with gentle rose-coloured light, the widow's first sight was of the flour jar sitting exactly where she had left it. With her heart pounding, she crept quietly across the room, not wanting to wake her son until she knew whether their hope would survive the night. The flour was there, the oil was there, enough for another day, another meal, another small victory against the spectre of starvation that had haunted their home for so long. And so began a rhythm that would sustain them through the long months of drought that followed. Each morning, the widow would check the jar and jug with a mixture of faith and anxiety, never quite able to take the miracle for granted, always amazed to find their supplies replenished. Each day she would measure out enough for their daily bread, always careful to leave something behind, always trusting that tomorrow would bring the same mysterious provision. Word of the miracle did not spread through Zarephath, for the widow was a careful woman who understood that some blessings were meant to be treasured quietly, rather than proclaimed from rooftops. She continued her daily routines, drawing water when it could be found, tending to her small home, caring for her son. To her neighbours, she appeared to be surviving the drought no better or worse than anyone else. But those who knew her well began to notice subtle changes. The hollow look of desperate hunger faded from her eyes. Her son grew stronger rather than weaker as the drought continued. There was a peace about her that seemed strange in such difficult times, a quiet confidence that suggested she had found a source of strength that the drought could not touch. Elijah became a regular visitor to their home, though he was careful to come and go discreetly, not wanting to draw attention that might put the widow and her son in danger. The prophet had found lodging in a small room at the edge of town, but he took many of his meals with the family he'd come to think of as his own. The widow always set a place for him at their modest table, always insisted that there was enough to share. As the weeks turned to months, the relationship between the prophet, the widow and her son deepened into something resembling family. Elijah told them stories of his travels, of the wonders he had seen, and the voice of God he had learned to recognize in wind and whisper. The widow shared the wisdom she had gleaned from years of making do with little, of finding joy in simple things, of holding on to hope when circumstances suggested it was foolish to do so. The boy, who had initially been shy around the imposing prophet, gradually warmed to Elijah's gentle nature and began to see him as something between a grandfather and a teacher. Elijah taught him to read the Hebrew alphabet, to recognize the patterns of weather and season, to understand that the God of Israel was not just a God of the Israelites, but a God who cared for all his children, regardless of their nationality or circumstances. Through it all, the miracle continued. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the jar of flour did not become empty, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Sometimes the widow would peer into the containers and see what appeared to be exactly the same amount as the day before. Other times there seemed to be a little more, as if the divine provider had sensed their need for extra sustenance, or simply wanted to remind them of his abundant love. The miracle was not one of overwhelming abundance. The widow never found her home suddenly filled with grain sacks or her courtyard overflowing with amphorae of oil. The provision was measured daily, sufficient. It was the miracle of enough for today, enough for now, enough to take the next step in faith. As the months passed, the widow began to understand that she was living in the midst of a parable, a living illustration of how divine providence works in the world. God did not promise to fill her storehouses with abundance, but he promised that each day would bring what was needed for that day. It was a lesson in trust, in living one day at a time, in believing that the same power that provided today would provide tomorrow. The drought continued to devastate the land around them. Wells dried up completely, rivers became cracked beds of stone, crops failed utterly. Neighbouring towns reported widespread famine, and travellers brought stories of desperation and death from across the region. Yet in the small home at the end of the narrow alley in Zarephath, a widow and her son and a prophet of God continued to eat bread each day, sustained by flour that did not diminish and oil that did not fail. There were moments when the widow found herself wondering if she was dreaming, if the whole experience was some elaborate fantasy created by a mind pushed to the brink by starvation. But then she would see Elijah's weathered face across their simple table, would hear her son's laughter as he played in the courtyard, would taste the reality of the bread in her mouth, and she would know that she was living in the midst of the miraculous. The widow learned to live with wonder as her constant companion. Each morning brought the possibility of disappointment, yet each morning brought instead the confirmation of promise kept. She learned that faith was not a single dramatic leap, but a daily choice to trust, a daily decision to act on belief rather than sight. As the seasons cycled and the drought persisted, the widow's faith deepened from desperate hope to quiet confidence. She had seen the faithfulness of God demonstrated not in spectacular signs and wonders, but in the daily grace of provision, in the steady reliability of a promise kept day after day after day. Her son, too, was changed by their experience. The boy who had faced starvation learned that he served a God who provided for his children, who noticed the needs of the small and insignificant, who could be trusted to keep his word even when all evidence suggested otherwise. The lessons he learned at his mother's table, watching flour and oil multiply through divine grace, would shape his understanding of faith for the rest of his life. And Elijah found his own faith strengthened as he witnessed the widow's daily trust. This foreign woman, this Gentile who had no obligation to believe in the God of Israel, demonstrated a quality of faith that put many of his own countrymen to shame. She trusted not because she understood, but because she chose to believe. She obeyed not because the path was clear, but because she was willing to walk into mystery. The miracle of the flour and oil became more than mere physical provision. It became a daily sacrament, a reminder that the God who made the universe was intimately involved in the details of their lives. Every meal was a communion, every shared bread a celebration of divine faithfulness. Through it all, the rhythm of ordinary life continued. The widow swept her floors, mended their clothes, drew what water could be found. Her son played with other children when energy permitted, helped with household tasks, grew taller and stronger despite the famine that surrounded them. Elijah prayed, studied, taught, and waited for the word of the Lord that would eventually send him back to Israel to confront the king and end the drought. But in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the evening meal was finished and they sat together in the glow of their small fire, all three understood that they were witnessing something eternal. They were living proof that God's love extends beyond the boundaries of nation and tribe, that his provision flows to all who trust him, and that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains of impossibility. The widow would often reflect on that first day when Elijah had asked for her last handful of flour. She had stood at the crossroads between fear and faith, between holding tight to what little she had and releasing it into the hands of an unknown God. Her choice to trust, to give when she had nothing left to give, had opened the door to a miracle that sustained not just her body, but her soul. As the months passed, other miracles followed. The widow's health improved, her son grew strong, and their small home became a beacon of hope in a drought-stricken land. Neighbours began to notice that this family seemed to weather the crisis better than most, though they never suspected the divine intervention that made it possible. Elijah taught them that true wealth was not measured in the size of one's storehouses, but in the faithfulness of one's provider. The widow learned that obedience to God's word, even when it seemed to contradict human wisdom, always led to blessing. Her son discovered that the God of Israel was also his God, that divine love knew no boundaries of race or nationality. Years later, when the drought finally ended, and rain fell once again on the parched earth, the widow would remember these days as the most precious of her life, not because they were easy, but because they were holy. In her poverty she had discovered riches. In her weakness she had found strength. In her emptiness she had encountered the fullness of God's love. The jar of flour never ran empty until the day the rains came. The jug of oil never ran dry until the crisis passed. And the faith that began with a handful of flour and a desperate prayer grew into a testimony that would echo through generations, reminding all who heard it that God's provision is always sufficient, his timing always perfect, and his love always faithful. In the quiet of your own heart tonight, as you rest in the peace of this ancient story, remember the widow's courage. Remember that sometimes faith looks like giving when you have nothing left to give, trusting when you cannot see the way forward, believing when all evidence suggests you should despair. Remember that the same God who provided for a widow in Zarephath provides for you today. He sees your needs, knows your fears, and holds your tomorrow in his hands. Sleep now in the assurance that his love surrounds you, his grace sustains you, and his faithfulness will carry you through every season of your life. The jar of flour will not be empty, the jug of oil will not run dry, and the God who multiplied a widow's faith will multiply yours as well, one day at a time, one meal at a time, one breath at a time. Rest well, dear friend. Tomorrow brings new mercies, fresh provision, and the continued unfolding of God's perfect plan for your life. Like the widow of Zarephath, you can trust that there will always be enough. As we close this sacred story tonight, let your heart rest in the truth that the same God who provided for the widow provides for you. In your own seasons of scarcity, whether of resources or hope or strength, remember that divine provision often comes not as abundance but as enough. Enough for today, enough for now, enough to take the next step in faith. The widow's miracle was not that her cupboards overflowed, but that they never emptied. Sometimes God's greatest gift is not more, but sufficient. Not wealth, but provision. Not ease, but sustenance for the journey. Sleep now, knowing that the Keeper of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, and that his eye is upon you with the same loving attention he showed to a foreign widow in an ancient town. Your jar will not be empty. Your jug will not run dry. His faithfulness endures forever. Rest well, dear soul, rest well. Hello, dear friends. and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not. A king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah son of Imlah was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, Your Majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. And the Lord said, "These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political maneuvering they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life, while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home. Absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring. But he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth-Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king who had tried to outwit divine judgment slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.